What's going on, guys? So today I'm going to show you how to build a fence for around 50 bucks for your Porter Cable 14-inch bandsaw. Now this saw is a really popular option, especially with newer woodworkers, because they're not having to spend $1,500 or $1,800 on a bandsaw. And for around $500 to $600, you can buy one of these brand new at your local Lowe's, throw it in the back of your truck, get home and get to cutting. So it's a really popular option. The only couple of drawbacks I have found with it is that there is not a whole lot of ripping capacity, but there are riser block options for the saw. I just don't have one yet. I will be getting one of those in the future. And the next part is it doesn't have a fence. I really enjoy using a fence just to make sure I'm getting a nice straight cut. Especially when I'm doing things like trying to just cut down little projects in a hurry. I want a more precise cut, and it's much easier to do that with a fence. So I didn't want to spend around $150, I believe it is, for like the Craig fence setup, even though it is really nice. I just wanted to see if I could build an accurate, nice fence setup for around 50 bucks using parts from Harbor Freight and Home Depot. So let's get at it and get this thing built. So as you guys can see on the table here, it does have holes to mount a fence, but there is no fence that comes with it. I had done this previously, where I had marked this center line here with the blade, and then marked out some markings on the table just to use with a clamp down fence style. And it works, but it's a bit of a pain in the butt. So I want a little bit more of a permanent situation. So I want to go over the plan just a little bit on this. This bar here is from Harbor Freight. I think it's about $15. It is 1-inch square tubing. It's really rigid and stiff. It's a 48-inch piece. And that's what's going to be the main slide rails on each side of the table. This is actually going to be our clamp that we used to clamp down on the fence, and this will actually be the walls of our new fence. So hopefully everything goes together properly. I planned on marking the rails on the top and bottom with these tape measure markers. They are not super crazy accurate, but they are accurate enough to use for what I'm wanting, and they should glue down and give me a nice ability to clamp this down and make sure that the fence is perfectly straight, as well as give me a gauge on my distance from the blade.
Now that I have all my parts laid out, it's time to start working on the rails that will bolt to the side of the bandsaw table. This square stock is 48 inches long, so I decided the easiest and best course of action was to cut it directly in half at 24. If you have a metal cutting chop saw or a horizontal bandsaw that can cut metal, it is much better to use that. As I do not have those, I decided just to use a cutoff wheel. It is always fun working with metal, but if you're working inside your shop, make sure you have nothing flammable around. These sparks can cause a lot of problems. And also, if you're going to use a cutoff wheel like this one, please make sure to use a guard and wear all your protective gear. These things can be very dangerous. After getting the bar into two pieces, I used the cutoff wheel to lightly round over and just kind of smooth off the edges I had just cut. I just didn't want any sharp edges sticking out or any kind of burrs that could catch on my hands or anything else, or clothing as I walked by the bandsaw. Marking the holes for the mounting points of the rails was pretty simplistic. After getting the distance between center to center of the mounting holes on the table, I just took that and subtracted that from the length of the rails, and then divided what was left by 2 and knew where to mark from the end of each rail. There will be 4 total holes in each rail. 2 of the holes will be just large enough for the threaded section of an M6 hex head bolt to fit through, and this will actually be the hole that is against the table of the saw. And the other hole will be a 1/2 inch hole that allows us to install that hex head bolt through the other side of the rail. After all the positions were marked, I use a center punch to cause a small indentation, which will help a lot once I start drilling the holes. Something else you might notice is that the 2 sets of holes on the front rail are pretty much centered inside this square stock, and the other 2 holes for the back rail are actually offset toward the bottom of the rail. This is due to the actual mounting points on the table being at different heights from the top of the table. I wanted the top of the rails to be close to flush with the top of the table, but if push come to shove, I would rather them be a tiny bit below the edge of the table just to keep from any stock or material hitting them while I was cutting. After drilling the 4 holes with the smaller bit, I moved to the 1/2 inch bit. Now I also used some 3-in-1 oil to make this cutting a little easier, but as you could see, the bit still grabs a little bit, especially on the rear rail, where I'm actually having to cut somewhat into the lower wall of the tube. When drilling the larger hole, you only go through one side of the rail. You do not need to go through both sides, as then your hex head bolt will not actually hold the rail in place. You will notice that I also tilt the drill bit and rotate it slightly. This is just to ream out the hole a tiny bit, just to ensure that the hex head bolt head fits cleanly through this hole and I don't have any problems bolting the rails in place. If you do have access to a drill press, I highly suggest using it. This can be a little bit dangerous, as if you're using a corded drill like I am and the bit catches, it's very torquey and can twist your arm or pull the drill out of your hands. And again, the 3-in-1 oil makes a really big difference. It keeps the bit a little bit cooler and helps lubricate the cut and makes the cut much easier. Also, make sure to use a very sharp bit. If you do not have a sharp one, sharpen it, or I would suggest getting one. Now just simply bolt the rail in place and do this on both sides, and you will see that the rail is slightly underneath the edge of the table. And when finished bolting both rails into place, you will also see that both rails should be pretty much parallel and lined up at the ends with each other. Now that both rails are secured in position, you can use your clamp and mark a center line on your table and on the rails. You do this by locking the clamp in position, lightly setting against the edge of your bandsaw blade. Do not press into the blade so that it deforms, as you want a true line down the inside edge of the blade. This will be your reference point for laying down the measurement tape, as well as give you a reference point on the table itself for center. I use CA glue and a little bit of activator to lay out the measuring tape on the rails. Now, when laying this first rail, afterwards I noticed it was a little crooked, so I actually pulled it up and noticed that it pulled up quite easy, as there's a residue on the rails. So make sure to clean the rails really well with alcohol or something along that line before laying down your tape. And also afterwards, what I did was laid another bead of CA along the edges of the tape and used some activator just to dry it quickly. This was just to hold the tape securely in place. With the tape in place, I used the clamp to actually cut down the walls that would be the fence. Now this is something you do not have to do. As you can see, you can use the clamp by itself without any vertical walls, but I prefer to have at least a couple of inches of wall beside the blade. This allows for any slightly taller projects to be firmly against the wall of the fence without rotating in or out, and give you more of a perpendicular cut. After the pieces for the walls were cut to width, I cut them to length to fit flush with the square ends of the clamp rail. I have fixed the rails into place on the sides of the clamp using some thick Starbond CA glue adhesive. This stuff works great, and you can spray a little bit of activator on the side of the board before lining the board up with the bottom of the clamp, and the CA glue will quickly set, holding the board in place, getting ready to actually screw it in its permanent position. Also, make sure when you're doing this to line up the bottom of the board or the wall with the bottom of your clamp. If you do not do this properly, it can offset how your clamp sets once it's clamped into place against the bandsaw table. Repeat this process on both sides. Once the CA glue is set, use a countersink bit and drill 3 holes into each wall of the fence, countersinking the screws so they do not stick out and cause any problems with any material or projects that would be sliding along the fence rail. For this, I used a simple countersink and wood screws, and they held just fine, and I believe they'll do just fine over time. Also, this can be used to back the screw out and adjust any square that you need to against the table to give you a perfect 90-degree fit. With the walls of the fence attached to the clamp, I cut some spacers to go into each end of the fence, and this would help square up the walls to ensure I had as close to a 90-degree angle to the table as I could get. These pieces are not load-bearing, so some wood glue and brad nails hold them in place just fine, and you shouldn't have any problems from that. I also added a longer spanner piece in the center of the walls. This is just to shore up the walls and stop them from flexing if anything presses on them or if you have a taller project leaning against the fence. With the fence complete, it was time for the first test cut. I wanted to try to get as close as I could to a 1.5 inch cut and see how accurate that it would be with the new fence. After setting the fence and cutting down a scrap piece of the plywood, I used a pair of calipers to check the width of the wood, and as you can see, it is almost dead on.
That'll do, pig. That'll do.
The fence is done, and I'm really happy with it. As you can see, I cut this board down shooting for 1.5 inches. I threw some calipers on it, and it is almost dead nuts 1.5 inches. So I am super happy with that. The fence is vertical, or perpendicular to the bed of the saw. I've done checked that a couple times. It looks really nice, and it's not too difficult to set up. It's a little strange. I've got an idea for a way to make it to where it will slide better and actually slide as one cohesive unit, but that will be for another video. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Make sure to go check out the full article on this build where I'll detail how I built it, where I got all the parts, and I'll even try to look up and link some of the parts and pieces that are in the fence. And I will make sure to answer any questions you have, but that will all be on the website. I will have the link in the description below. Make sure to go check out Instagram as well. Give me a follow there. I post videos and pictures daily. So guys, I appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys on the next one.